wonderful. Just absolutely perfect. Here I was, Dr. Elena Vasquez, xenobiologist extraordinaire, expecting to spend my assignment studying the fascinating riparian ecosystems of Kepler 442b in peaceful solitude. And what do I get instead? A housing committee. Because apparently, even on alien planets 47 light-years from Earth, bureaucracy finds a way to ruin everything. The Zephyrian delegation had arrived 3 days after I'd finished setting up my research station by the Silverflow River. And when I say finished setting up, I mean I'd spent 2 weeks assembling what could charitably be called a floating laboratory, and what anyone with eyes would recognize as the galaxy's most over-engineered treehouse built on pontoons. But hey, it worked. The modular habitat pods connected by flexible walkways, solar collectors that actually managed to stay clean despite the planet's tendency to rain purple pollen, and a water purification system that could probably handle whatever the local wildlife decided to contribute to the water supply. I was cataloging the 17 different species of what I'd dubbed river sprites. Tiny bioluminescent creatures that looked like someone had crossed a seahorse with a Christmas light when the Zephyrian transport touched down on the opposite bank. Standard diplomatic vessel, all smooth curves and that peculiar shimmer their hull materials produced in sunlight. The delegation that emerged was, well, let me put it this way. You know how in all the old sci-fi movies, aliens were either completely humanoid or utterly monstrous? The Zephyrians had apparently decided to split the difference and then add some extra credit work. They were vaguely feline. If cats had evolved to walk upright, developed opposable thumbs, and decided that having only one tail was for amateurs. Their fur came in patterns that would make a kaleidoscope jealous, and they had this habit of their ear tufts twitching in synchronized patterns when they were thinking, which, as I was about to learn, was constantly. Ambassador Crixtal was clearly the leader, standing nearly 7 feet tall with silver-blue fur marked by geometric patterns that seemed to shift when he moved. Beside him stood what I initially assumed was his aide, a slightly smaller Zephyrian with rust-colored fur, and the kind of alert posture that screamed professional problem solver. This was Sub-Commander Ven Kai, and let me tell you, that title was doing a lot of work, because what he actually turned out to be was a disaster management specialist. Though I didn't know that yet. The third member of their little party was the one who immediately caught my attention, mainly because she was attempting to climb a tree while the other two were busy being diplomatically impressive. Irix Nala was what the Zephyrians called a cub tender, which translated roughly to the person we trust with our most precious treasures, and also the person most likely to end up covered in mud by the end of any given day. Dr. Vasquez, Ambassador Crixtal called out, his translator producing that slightly metallic overlay that made everyone sound like they were speaking from inside a tin can. We greet you in the name of the Zephyrian Exploration Collective. I paddled my little survey boat over to their side of the river, trying to look professional while simultaneously wondering if the diplomatic protocols I'd hastily reviewed on the journey here had mentioned anything about proper greeting procedures. Probably should have paid more attention to that section. Ambassador, I said, managing what I hoped was an appropriately respectful nod. Welcome to Kepler 442b. I wasn't expecting a diplomatic mission. Crixtal's ear tufts did that synchronized twitch thing. Ah, yes, there has been a development. We have been assigned joint research privileges for this sector. I blinked. Joint research privileges? By the Galactic Scientific Cooperation Treaty of 2387. Venkai added helpfully, producing a holographic document that was apparently longer than most novels. Article 47, subsection 12 gamma states that when multiple species express interest in studying the same celestial body, research facilities and findings must be shared in accordance with established protocols. You know that moment when you realize that all your careful planning has just been thrown out the window by something you never saw coming. That was this moment. I'd specifically chosen this remote location precisely because nobody else had shown any interest in it. The planet was stable, boring, and had the kind of ecosystem that required months of patient observation to understand. Perfect for someone who wanted to work alone. "I see," I said, which was diplomat speak for, "Oh, you have got to be kidding me." That's when Nala fell out of the tree. She landed with a splash in the shallow water near the bank, and before anyone could react, she popped up sputtering and laughing, a sound like wind chimes mixed with a purring engine. "The branch growth patterns are fascinating," she announced to no one in particular, as if falling into rivers was just part of her standard research methodology. Which, as I would learn, it basically was. "Nala," Venkai sighed. "Perhaps you could conduct your botanical observations from a more terrestrial position. But the perspective from above provides crucial data about canopy density," she protested, wringing river water from her fur. "Also, I believe I discovered why the local flora has such unusual root structures." Ambassador Krixtal looked at me with the expression of someone who had been dealing with enthusiastic researchers for far too long. "Dr. Vasquez, I understand this may not be what you were expecting." That was putting it mildly. "I'd come here to study river ecosystems in peace, not to become the unwilling host of what appeared to be the galaxy's most overeager research team. But the thing about diplomatic situations is that you can't really tell a galactic treaty to go stuff itself, no matter how much you might want to." "Well," I said, trying to inject some enthusiasm into my voice, "I suppose the more perspectives we have on the local ecosystem, the better our understanding will be." Which was how I found myself giving a tour of my carefully planned research station to 3 aliens who seemed determined to find something fascinating in every single component of my setup. Krixtal was impressed by the modular design and the way I'd managed to integrate the habitat with the natural flow of the river. Venkai wanted to know about the power systems and whether they'd be scalable for a larger operation. And Nala wanted to know if she could modify the observation deck to better accommodate her habit of hanging upside down while taking notes. The inverted perspective provides a completely different understanding of spatial relationships, she explained, demonstrating by immediately flipping herself over the deck railing and dangling by her feet. "From this angle, you can see how the water patterns create micro-eddies around the support pylons that aren't visible from above." Or, she was right too, which was the most annoying part. "About the living arrangements," Venkai said diplomatically, "we had assumed we would be establishing our own research facility nearby." I gestured toward the banks of the river, where the ground rose sharply into dense forest on one side and fell away into marshland on the other. "Good luck finding a suitable location." This was literally the only spot within 50 kilometers that had the right combination of stable ground, river access, and sight lines for proper observation. The 3 Zephyrians exchanged glances, their ear tufts twitching in what I was learning to recognize as their version of silent communication. "Perhaps," Ambassador Krixtal said carefully, "we could discuss a temporary sharing arrangement." And that's how I ended up with 3 alien roommates. The next few days were an adjustment period. Let me put this in perspective. I had designed my floating research station for one person, one human person who liked things organized, quiet, and predictable. What I got instead was a situation that could best be described as controlled chaos with occasional moments of brilliant scientific insight. Krix Tal was actually the easiest to deal with. He set up his equipment with military precision, maintained detailed logs of everything, and had the courtesy to ask before rearranging shared spaces. His research focused on atmospheric composition and its effects on plant growth, which complemented my work nicely without getting in the way. Venkai turned out to be invaluable once I got used to his habit of treating every potential problem as a crisis that needed immediate contingency planning. He'd taken one look at my power systems and immediately started designing backups for the backups. Within 2 days, he'd rigged emergency protocols for everything from solar panel failure to, what if the river suddenly changes course? I hadn't realized how much I'd been unconsciously worrying about system failures until he addressed them all. But Irix Nala was going to be the death of me. She had apparently taken my comment about the more perspectives, the better, as a personal challenge to find new and increasingly creative viewpoints from which to conduct research. I'd wake up to find her suspended beneath the observation deck, studying the underside of river plants. I'd come back from a sample collection run to discover her perched on the solar panels, charting the migration patterns of the local equivalent of birds. Once, I found her floating face down in the water, completely motionless, and nearly gave myself a heart attack before realizing she was studying the behavior of bottom-feeding organisms and had figured out that they were less disturbed by her presence if she imitated a piece of floating debris. The woman had absolutely no sense of self-preservation, but her observations were brilliant. It was on the 5th day of our cohabitation experiment that things got complicated. Irix Nala had been unusually quiet that morning, which should have been my first warning sign. When Irix Nala was quiet, it usually meant she was planning something. I was running spectral analysis on water samples when she approached me. Her ear tufts twitching in the pattern I'd learned meant she was nervous. "Dr. Vasquez," she said, "I may have made a small error in judgment." In my experience, when someone starts a sentence with, "I may have made a small error in judgment," what they actually mean is, "I have done something that is about to make your life significantly more complicated." "What kind of error?" I asked, setting down my sample containers. "Well," she said, and I could practically hear her trying to figure out how to phrase this diplomatically. "You know how I've been studying the behavioral patterns of the local fauna?" "Yes. And your work on the symbiotic relationships between the aquatic mammals and the filter-feeding plants has been fascinating." Her ear tufts twitched faster. "Yes. Well, it turns out that some of the local fauna have been studying my behavioral patterns as well." I stared at her. What exactly does that mean? Before she could answer, I heard it. A soft, chittering sound coming from underneath the main habitat pod. Then another, and another. "Irix Nala," I said slowly, "please tell me you didn't—" "I may have accidentally convinced a family of river mammals that I'm their adopted pack leader," she said quickly. "But in my defense, their social structures are incredibly complex, and I was only trying to gain their trust for research purposes." The chittering was getting louder, and now I could hear splashing sounds as well. I walked to the edge of the deck and looked down into the water. Staring back at me were 6 pairs of large, intelligent eyes belonging to creatures that looked like someone had crossed an otter with a seal, and then decided to make the result about 3 times larger and significantly more adorable. They were floating in formation around the station's pontoons, and as soon as they saw me looking, they began what could only be described as excited squeaking. "They've been following me for the past 2 days," Irix Nala explained. "I think they've decided I'm part of their family unit." "Part of their family unit," I repeated. "The social dynamics are actually quite fascinating. They have a complex hierarchy based on Irix Nala." "Yes? Are those babies?" She looked down at the water where, sure enough, 3 much smaller versions of the creatures were now visible, staying close to what were presumably their parents. "Ah," she said. "Yes. Those would be cubs." I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. "You've accidentally adopted a family of alien river mammals." "Temporarily adopted," she corrected. "I'm sure once they realize I'm not actually part of their species, they'll lose interest and return to their normal behavioral patterns." That was when the cubs started trying to climb onto the station. Now, let me explain something about the pontoon design of my research station. The walkways were set about 1 meter above the water surface to prevent flooding during high tide. What I hadn't anticipated was that this would turn them into the perfect height for determined semi-aquatic mammals to haul themselves up for a visit. The first cub made it onto the deck with a wet thump, shook itself vigorously, soaking both Irix Nala and me in the process, and then began what appeared to be a thorough inspection of our equipment. The second one followed moments later, and the third one was apparently more interested in trying to get inside the habitat pod itself. "Oh no," I muttered, rushing toward the entrance to head off our newest visitor. No, you can't go in there." The cub paused at the threshold and looked up at me with those large, impossibly expressive eyes. Then it made a sound that was part squeak, part purr, and entirely heart-melting. "Don't you dare," I told it. "Don't you dare look at me like that." It tilted its head to one side, ear flaps twitching, and made the sound again. I was doomed. Behind me, I could hear Venkai emerging from his workstation. "What is the cause of this commotion?" he asked, then stopped short when he saw the cubs sitting politely in the doorway. "Ah, we appear to have visitors. Irix Nala has accidentally convinced a family of river mammals that she's their pack leader," I explained, trying to gently discourage the cub from entering my habitat without actually touching it. I had no idea what kind of diseases or parasites the local wildlife might carry. And the last thing I needed was to explain to Earth's medical authorities how I'd managed to contract some exotic alien plague. Crix Tal appeared next, took in the situation at a glance, and began that rapid ear-tuft communication with the other Zephyrians. "What are they saying?" I asked. "They're discussing whether this falls under the category of routine research complications or unprecedented diplomatic incident," Venkai translated helpfully. "The distinction is important for filing the proper reports." I stared at him. "Reports?" "All interactions with indigenous life forms must be documented according to Galactic Biological Survey protocols," he explained. "Particularly when said interactions result in behavioral modifications in the local fauna." "Nobody told me about..." I started, then stopped. Because the cub had gotten tired of waiting for permission and had simply wandered into my habitat pod like it owned the place. I found it in my main living area, standing on its hind legs with its front paws on my work desk, apparently fascinated by my holographic display of local water chemistry data. As I watched, it reached out with one paw and actually managed to manipulate the display, rotating the molecular structure I'd been analyzing. Okay, that's actually kind of impressive, I admitted. The cub looked back at me and made that purring squeak sound again, then returned its attention to the hologram. It seemed particularly interested in the sections dealing with mineral content and pH levels. You know, Irix Nala said from the doorway, their neural development is quite advanced. It's possible they're capable of understanding symbolic representations. Are you suggesting that this cub is actually comprehending my research data? Well, look at what it's focusing on, she pointed out. Those are the same mineral concentrations that affect the growth patterns of its primary food sources. If these creatures have evolved to recognize environmental indicators that impact their survival, it would make sense that they'd be drawn to information about water chemistry. I watched as the cub continued to manipulate the display, seemingly trying to zoom in on specific data points. It was definitely not random behavior. This is incredible, I murmured. If they're actually capable of interpreting symbolic information, it means their intelligence level is far higher than we initially assessed. That's when the other two cubs found us, and their parents. And apparently, word had spread through whatever communication network river mammals used, because within an hour, my research station was hosting what could only be described as an interspecies conference. Krixtal was in full diplomatic mode, taking detailed notes on everything while maintaining what he probably thought was a safe distance from our visitors. Venkai had immediately started working on contingency plans for what if they decide to stay permanently, and what if more of them show up? And Irix Nala was absolutely in her element, documenting behavioral patterns and trying to establish some kind of communication protocol. Me? I was trying not to panic as my carefully organized research station turned into what looked like a cross between a marine biology lab and a daycare center. The adult river mammals seemed content to float nearby and observe. But the cubs were everywhere. One was still fascinated by the holographic displays. Another had discovered my sample storage area and was methodically examining each container, without opening them, thankfully. The third had found my sleeping area and decided that my bed was the perfect place for a nap. Dr. Vasquez, Venkai said, I believe we may need to establish some ground rules for this situation. You think? I said, watching as one of the cubs figured out how to activate my environmental controls and began adjusting the temperature. They're redecorating. Actually, Irix Nala said, look at what temperature it's selecting. I looked. The cub had adjusted the habitat's internal temperature to exactly match the water temperature of the river. They're trying to make the environment more comfortable for everyone, I realized. They're not just exploring randomly, they're actively trying to optimize the space for multi-species habitation. Krixtal's ear tufts were practically vibrating with excitement. This suggests a level of environmental awareness and social cooperation that we've never documented in a non-sentient species. Who says they're non-sentient? I asked. The question hung in the air for a moment. We were all looking at the cubs, who were now working together to examine my research equipment with what was clearly systematic methodology. One would manipulate a device or display, the others would observe the results, and then they'd trade positions and repeat the process. Oh, Irix Nala said softly. Oh my. What? They're not just exploring. They're conducting experiments. She was right. As we watched, the cubs performed the same sequence of actions multiple times, with slight variations, clearly testing different approaches to manipulating the equipment. When one approach yielded interesting results, the others would immediately adopt the same technique. "We need to contact the Galactic Survey immediately," Krixtal said. "If these creatures demonstrate true sentience, this planet's status will need to be completely re-evaluated. And our research permits will need to be reviewed," Venkai added. "Unauthorized contact with sentient species violates about 17 different treaties." I sat down heavily in my desk chair, which immediately put me at eye level with the cub that was still analyzing my water chemistry data. It looked at me, then at the holographic display, then back at me. Then it made a series of soft chirping sounds and gestured with one paw toward a specific data cluster. "I think it's trying to tell me something about the mineral concentrations in Sector 7, I said weakly. The cub nodded. Actually nodded. "Okay," I said. "Okay, this is happening. We've made first contact with a sentient aquatic species. They've apparently decided that my research station is now their vacation home, and one of them is trying to collaborate on my water chemistry analysis. Look on the bright side," Irix Nala said cheerfully. "At least they're helpful." As if to prove her point, one of the adult river mammals surfaced near the station carrying something in its mouth. It climbed onto the deck with surprising grace and deposited what appeared to be a collection of mineral samples at my feet. "Are those from the riverbed?" I asked. The creature made a complex series of clicks and chirps, then nudged the samples toward my laboratory equipment. "I think it wants you to analyze them," Venkai said. "They've been watching us work," I realized. "They understand what we're doing here, and they want to contribute." Over the next hour, it became clear that our situation had evolved far beyond anything any of us had anticipated. The river mammals weren't just intelligent. They were actively participating in our research. They brought us samples from areas of the river we hadn't explored yet. They demonstrated behaviors we'd never observed. And most remarkably, they seemed to understand that we were studying their ecosystem and were actively helping us do it better. The cubs, meanwhile, had essentially moved in. One was still working with the holographic displays, apparently having figured out how to call up different data sets. Another was organizing my sample containers according to some system that actually made more sense than my original arrangement. The third had claimed my sleeping area as its own and was making what appeared to be improvements to the bedding situation. "So," I said to my alien companions, "any suggestions for how we handle this in our reports?" "I recommend we focus on the unprecedented opportunity for collaborative research," Krixtal said diplomatically. "And the fact that we've accidentally established the galaxy's first interspecies research cooperative?" I asked. "That too." Venkai looked up from his contingency planning. "I've drafted initial protocols for maintaining optimal living conditions for multiple species aboard a modified research station." "You've already figured out how to make this permanent?" I asked. "Of course. The probability of our new colleagues returning to their previous lifestyle now that they've discovered the advantages of collaborative research is approximately 0. He was right too. Over the following days, it became clear that our river mammal friends had no intention of leaving. They'd established a rotation system where some individuals would remain at the station to participate in research activities, while others returned to their normal activities in the river. The cubs had settled into what could only be described as a routine, spending their mornings working with our equipment and their afternoons playing in the water. And the truly remarkable thing was how well it was working. The river mammals' intimate knowledge of their ecosystem provided insights we never could have gained on our own. Their ability to navigate underwater environments allowed them to collect samples from locations we couldn't reach. And their apparently natural understanding of environmental relationships helped us identify patterns in our data that we'd been missing. You know, I said to Yurix Nala one evening, as we watched the cubs demonstrate their latest discovery. They'd figured out how to operate the water filtration system and were apparently fascinated by the process. I came here specifically to avoid complications. And instead, you've helped establish first contact with a sentient aquatic species and created a new model for interspecies scientific collaboration, she pointed out. I'd say that's a significant improvement over your original plan. I had to admit, she had a point. Yes, my quiet solo research mission had turned into something resembling a combination embassy, laboratory, and boarding house for highly intelligent river mammals. But the work we were accomplishing together was extraordinary. In 1 week, we learned more about the Silverflow River ecosystem than I could have discovered in months of solitary research. The cubs had also figured out how to operate the communication systems and had apparently started sending messages to other river mammal communities. Because 3 days later, we woke up to find representatives from 6 different family groups floating around our station, apparently waiting for their turn to participate in whatever it was we were doing. I believe, Ambassador Crix Tal said, as we looked out at our growing collection of research collaborators, that we're going to need a bigger station. Already working on the designs, Venkai replied. The new configuration should accommodate up to 30 individuals of various species, with separate work areas, sleeping quarters, and recreational facilities. Recreational facilities? I asked. The cubs have expressed interest in what appears to be a form of underwater volleyball, he explained seriously. I thought it best to include appropriate sports equipment in the specifications. I looked around at my floating research station, now home to 3 Zephyrians, 1 human, and a rotating population of highly intelligent river mammals who had apparently decided that scientific research was the most entertaining activity they'd encountered in years. You know what? I said. I'm okay with this. After all, I'd come to Kepler 442b to study river ecosystems. I just never expected the river ecosystem to decide to study me back. And honestly, they were much better at it than I'd expected. The cubs were still sleeping in my quarters, by the way. They'd built themselves little nests out of my spare blankets and had established a complex rotation schedule for who got to sleep closest to the heating unit. I'd tried to discourage this arrangement initially, but they'd looked at me with those impossibly expressive eyes and made those heart-melting purring sounds. And, well, let's just say that even galactic treaties have nothing on the persuasive power of adorable alien babies who want to be tucked in at night. Some battles just aren't worth fighting.